For more than a decade, PC gaming and Windows were treated as basically the same thing. If you wanted to play the latest release on a proper gaming rig, Windows was not just the obvious choice, it was practically the only real choice. Linux existed on the sidelines as a curiosity for programmers and open source enthusiasts, a system people admired in theory but rarely gamed on in practice. That entire assumption has been quietly collapsing over the past few years, and in 2026 it reached a genuine turning point. Valve released a brand new piece of living room hardware called the Steam Machine, opened its Linux-based operating system SteamOS to third-party desktop computers for the very first time, and watched major hardware manufacturers start shipping handheld gaming devices with SteamOS instead of Windows pre-installed. This is not hype, and it is not a niche story only Linux enthusiasts care about. This is a real documented shift happening across the entire PC gaming industry right now, and in this video we are going to walk through exactly what changed, why it changed, and what it means for anyone who plays games on a computer. Let's start with the numbers, because they tell a story that would have sounded impossible just a few years ago. According to Valve's own Steam hardware survey, which tracks the operating systems and hardware used by the platform's massive user base, Linux reached 3.2% of all Steam users in 2026, a fresh all-time high recorded for 2 consecutive months running. That might sound like a small slice of the pie, but Steam reports well over 130 million monthly active users, which means even a low single-digit percentage translates into millions of actual gaming machines running Linux instead of Windows. More importantly, this number has been climbing steadily rather than plateauing, reversing an entire decade, during which Linux gaming adoption hovered stubbornly around or below 1%. Something structural has clearly changed in how PC gamers think about their operating system choices, and that change did not happen by accident. The story of how we got here really begins with a single piece of hardware that most people initially dismissed as a fun experiment rather than a serious industry disruptor. Valve released the Steam Deck back in 2022, a handheld gaming device built specifically around SteamOS, its own Linux-based operating system. At the time, the biggest question hanging over the entire project was whether a Linux-powered handheld could actually run the massive library of games built almost exclusively for Windows. The answer came down to a piece of technology called Proton, a compatibility layer that Valve had been quietly developing that translates the way Windows games communicate with hardware into instructions Linux can understand and execute. Proton intercepts the graphics calls a Windows game makes and reroutes them through translation layers, including one component called DXVK that converts older Direct 3D graphics instructions into the modern Vulkan graphics standard, and another called VKD3D Proton that handles the newer Direct 3D 12 standard used in many current releases. The Steam Deck became the proving ground for this technology at a massive scale, and it worked far better than almost anyone in the industry expected. Once the Steam Deck demonstrated that Linux gaming could actually deliver a smooth, reliable experience for the average player rather than just technically minded hobbyists, Valve began steadily expanding the SteamOS ecosystem well beyond its own hardware. In 2026, that expansion reached a genuinely significant milestone. On June 17th, Valve released SteamOS version 3, 8.10, which for the first time officially supported installation on desktop PCs built around Intel or AMD hardware, not just Valve's own devices. Just 12 days later, on June 29th, Valve launched an entirely new piece of hardware called the Steam Machine, essentially a compact living room-focused gaming console that boots directly into SteamOS. This represented Valve's clearest and most direct challenge, yet to the assumption that serious PC gaming requires Windows, since here was a dedicated gaming computer sold directly to consumers, running Linux from the moment you turn it on. The expansion did not stop with Valve's own products either. Major PC hardware manufacturers, the same companies that have built their entire handheld gaming device lineups around Windows for years, started shipping SteamOS as an official option. Lenovo introduced a dual version of its Legion Go S handheld, offering customers the choice between a traditional Windows model and one that ships with SteamOS straight from the factory. Asus and MSI have followed with expanded support for their own popular handhelds, the ROG Ally and the Claw, bringing what Valve calls its enhanced SteamOS support tier to these third-party devices. Industry analysts following this space closely expect at least one more major manufacturer to announce its own factory SteamOS variant before the end of 2026, following the pattern Lenovo set with its dual model approach. Why would hardware manufacturers, who have profited from Windows licensing for decades, suddenly start offering Linux as a real alternative on their flagship gaming devices? The answer comes down to a combination of cost, performance, and consumer demand that has become impossible to ignore. Every Windows-powered handheld carries a Microsoft licensing fee baked directly into its retail price, an added cost that simply does not exist for devices running SteamOS since Linux is free and open source. In a product category where companies frequently compete over price gaps as small as $50, eliminating that licensing cost entirely gives manufacturers real pricing flexibility, along with leverage over Microsoft that some analysts have compared to the way Android's rise eventually pressured paid mobile operating systems more broadly. But cost savings alone would not be enough to drive this shift if the actual gaming experience suffered as a result. And this is where the real surprise in this story shows up. Independent testing conducted throughout 2026 has repeatedly found that switching identical handheld hardware from Windows to SteamOS produces dramatic, real-world improvements, particularly in battery life. Reviewers testing devices like the Lenovo Legion Go S found that games which lasted under 3 hours on a full battery charge running Windows stretched to as much as 7 hours running the exact same title on SteamOS, representing battery life improvements in the range of 20 to 40% across a broad range of tested games. On the performance side, independent benchmarking, including testing conducted by respected outlets covering the Legion Go S specifically, found that SteamOS matched or outright beat Windows 11 frame rates in the large majority of games tested, with only occasional exceptions favoring the Windows side. For handheld gaming specifically, where every extra hour of battery life directly translates into more actual playtime away from a charger, these are not minor technical footnotes. They are exactly the kind of tangible, immediately noticeable improvements that change how average consumers, not just enthusiasts, think about which operating system belongs on their gaming device. Compatibility, historically the single biggest obstacle standing between Linux and mainstream gaming adoption, has also narrowed dramatically faster than most people expected. Data compiled from ProtonDB, a community-driven database that tracks how well individual games run under Proton, alongside Valve's own compatibility testing, indicates that roughly 80% of the most played titles on Steam now run properly straight out of the box on SteamOS, either through native Linux support or through Proton's translation layer. That 80% figure matters enormously because it represents the threshold where a technology stops being an enthusiast curiosity requiring workarounds and troubleshooting, and starts becoming a genuinely viable default option for the average player who just wants their games to work without extra effort. Valve has continued refining Proton itself throughout 2026 as well, releasing a beta of Proton 11 built on a newer version of the underlying Wine compatibility software, adding support for new synchronization technology that can improve performance in certain games, and even releasing an ARM64 compatible build aimed at future ARM-based devices. A clear signal that Valve is thinking well beyond its current hardware lineup toward whatever comes next. Community-driven Linux gaming distributions have played an equally important role in this broader shift, sometimes even outpacing Valve's own official SteamOS and raw adoption growth. Bazzite, a free community-built Linux distribution based on Fedora, has become particularly significant in this space, explicitly designing itself to mirror the Steam Deck experience on any handheld or desktop computer a user already owns, rather than requiring Valve's own specific hardware. A major update to Bazzite released in April of 2026 shipped a newer gaming-tuned Linux kernel, updated graphics drivers, and a substantially leaner installation image, all specifically aimed at squeezing more usable storage space onto handheld devices with limited internal capacity. Bazzite's developers have been explicit that their roadmap is designed to match SteamOS feature for feature on hardware. Valve does not officially support itself, essentially extending the console-like Linux gaming experience to a much broader range of devices than Valve's own product lineup could ever cover on its own. Other community distributions, including Chimera OS and Nobara, have carved out their own niches in this same space, giving PC gamers considering a switch away from Windows multiple mature, well-tested options, rather than a single all-or-nothing choice. There remains one significant technical hurdle standing between Linux gaming and truly universal desktop adoption, and it is worth addressing honestly rather than glossing over it, because it is the single biggest caveat in this entire story. NVIDIA graphics cards, which hold a dominant share of the desktop gaming GPU market, have historically had a much rockier relationship with Linux compared to AMD and Intel hardware, largely because NVIDIA's approach to graphics drivers has traditionally been more proprietary and less open to the kind of community collaboration that Linux development generally depends on. As of the middle of 2026, official SteamOS support extends to AMD and Intel-powered desktop hardware. But NVIDIA GPU owners cannot yet install SteamOS and expect a fully working, polished gaming experience out of the box. The good news is that this gap is actively closing rather than staying frozen in place. Valve has publicly confirmed that its engineers are collaborating directly with NVIDIA on proper driver support for SteamOS, a partnership described by a Valve software engineer in an interview with The Verge as one of the most explicit public commitments the company has made, yet towards solving this specific compatibility problem. Most industry reporting suggests an initial basic level of NVIDIA support could arrive by late 2026 at the earliest, with a more complete, production-ready implementation covering the full range of features gamers expect, including advanced upscaling technology, high dynamic range support, and variable refresh rate compatibility, considered more realistic sometime in 2027. Until that work is finished, NVIDIA GPU owners who want a Steam OS-like experience today have generally turned to community distributions like Bazite, which maintain unofficial NVIDIA driver support with a reasonable, if not always perfectly polished, level of compatibility. It is also important to be upfront about where Linux gaming still falls short today, because presenting this shift honestly means acknowledging its real limitations rather than only its successes. The most significant remaining barrier is kernel-level anti-cheat software, the security systems that many competitive multiplayer games rely on to detect cheating, which frequently either do not function on Linux at all or require workarounds that publishers have been unwilling to officially support. This means several of the most popular competitive titles in the world, including major shooters and other online multiplayer games that depend on this kind of anti-cheat technology, simply cannot be played on SteamOS or other Linux gaming distributions right now, regardless of how good Proton's underlying compatibility technology has become. For gamers whose primary interest is competitive online play in these specific titles, Windows remains the only realistic option for the time being. Similarly, anyone deeply dependent on Windows exclusive creative software or on Microsoft's Game Pass subscription service will find that switching to Linux still requires some compromise. The honest, balanced takeaway is that Linux gaming has become genuinely excellent for the large majority of the most popular single-player and cooperative multiplayer titles on Steam, while remaining a poor fit for a specific but significant category of competitive online games protected by incompatible anti-cheat systems. Timing has also played an important supporting role in why this shift accelerated, specifically during 2026 rather than years earlier. Microsoft officially ended support for Windows 10 in October of 2025, pushing millions of PC owners to reconsider their operating system choices. Right around the same time, SteamOS was expanding to third-party hardware, and Valve was preparing to launch the Steam Machine. Many of these users found themselves owning older handheld devices or desktop computers that either could not meet Windows 11's stricter hardware requirements or simply felt underwhelming when forced into an upgrade cycle they had not planned for. A free, high-performing, increasingly compatible Linux gaming alternative arriving at almost exactly this moment gave a meaningful number of PC gamers a genuinely compelling reason to try something other than Windows for the first time, often discovering along the way that the experience was considerably smoother than they had assumed based on Linux's older, less polished reputation. The competitive pressure this entire shift places on Microsoft is genuinely significant, and it represents something the company has not really faced before in the PC gaming space specifically. Windows has effectively owned desktop and handheld PC gaming by default for the platform's entire modern history, with no serious mainstream alternative that gamers actively preferred on its own technical merits rather than simply tolerated out of necessity. SteamOS, particularly once it expanded beyond Valve's own hardware in 2026, represents the first credible challenger gamers are choosing not because it is free, though that certainly helps, but because independent testing shows it frequently delivers a better battery life and comparable or superior performance compared to Windows on the exact same hardware. That is a fundamentally different, more dangerous kind of competitive threat for Microsoft than anything Linux gaming has represented in the past, since it is being driven by gamers voluntarily choosing the alternative on pure merit rather than settling for it out of frustration or cost constraints alone. What does all of this actually mean if you are an everyday PC gamer trying to figure out whether any of this is relevant to your own setup? If the majority of your gaming library consists of single-player titles, cooperative games, or multiplayer games that do not rely on kernel-level anti-cheat systems, SteamOS or a community distribution like Bazite has genuinely become a realistic, often superior alternative to Windows, particularly on handheld devices where the battery life improvements alone can meaningfully change how you use the device day to day. If your gaming habits center heavily around specific competitive titles that currently require Windows due to anti-cheat restrictions, or if you rely heavily on Windows exclusive software or subscription services for other parts of your computing life, sticking with Windows for now remains the more practical choice, at least until those specific compatibility gaps close further. The good news for anyone curious about experimenting is that trying Linux gaming today carries very little risk. Distributions like Bazite can be installed on a completely separate drive alongside an existing Windows installation, letting you test the experience firsthand while keeping your familiar setup intact as a fallback if something does not work the way you expect. Valve did not stop at the Steam Machine and expanded desktop support when reshaping its hardware lineup in 2026. Alongside the Steam Machine, the company also introduced a new version of the Steam controller featuring magnetic analog sticks designed to resist the drift problems that plague many traditional controllers over time, along with dual trackpads, gyroscopic motion controls, haptic feedback, and a battery rated for up to 35 hours of continuous use. Perhaps even more significant from a platform strategy standpoint, Valve also announced the Steam Frame, a standalone virtual reality headset also built around SteamOS, extending Valve's Linux-based ecosystem into an entirely new hardware category beyond traditional flat-screen gaming altogether. Taken together, the Steam Machine, the new Steam controller, and the Steam Frame represent Valve's clearest statement yet that SteamOS is no longer meant to be understood as a single device's operating system, but rather as a unified platform meant to span handhelds, living room consoles, desktop PCs, and now virtual reality hardware, all running the same underlying Linux foundation and benefiting from the same ongoing Proton compatibility improvements. This kind of hardware diversity matters strategically because it means Valve is no longer dependent on any single product category to keep proving out the viability of Linux gaming. Even if one specific device underperforms in the market, the broader SteamOS ecosystem continues accumulating real-world usage data, developer attention, and compatibility improvements across every other device sharing that same software foundation. It is worth remembering that Valve's own history with living room hardware includes some real setbacks that make the current wave of success particularly notable by comparison. The original Steam Machine concept from 2013 was widely regarded as a commercial disappointment, undermined by fragmented hardware partners, inconsistent pricing across different manufacturers, and, most critically, a version of SteamOS that simply could not run the vast majority of existing PC games without extensive native porting work that most developers had little incentive to undertake. Valve's decision to revive the Steam Machine concept in 2026, more than a decade later, only makes sense once you account for how completely the underlying compatibility problem has been solved in the intervening years through Proton. Rather than asking players to accept a smaller, curated library of natively ported Linux games, the way the original Steam machines effectively did, the new version can draw on the same enormous back catalog of Windows games that already works through Proton across the Steam Deck and expanding desktop support, removing the single biggest weakness that doomed the original attempt from ever really getting off the ground. It helps to understand just how long Valve has actually been working toward this specific moment, because this is not a sudden pivot the company decided on overnight. Valve's interest in Linux as a gaming platform actually traces back well over a decade to an earlier and far less successful attempt at bringing Linux-based gaming hardware into people's living rooms. Back in 2013, Valve first announced an original version of SteamOS, alongside a lineup of partner-built hardware known as Steam Machines, an ambitious early effort to challenge traditional console gaming with Linux-powered PCs. At the time, Valve's own leadership was already publicly framing Linux and open-source software as fundamental to the future of gaming, arguing that relying entirely on a single closed platform left the entire industry vulnerable. That first generation of Steam machines ultimately failed to gain meaningful traction, largely because the underlying software and game compatibility simply were not mature enough yet to support it, and the project quietly faded from the spotlight for several years afterward. What changed between that first failed attempt and today's far more successful expansion was the years of unglamorous, incremental engineering work that went into building Proton, and steadily improving it, release after release, largely happening outside the public spotlight while most of the gaming industry assumed Linux gaming remained a dead end. The 2022 launch of the original Steam Deck gave that patient investment a genuine opportunity to prove itself at scale, and once it succeeded, it gave Valve enough confidence and enough real-world compatibility data to justify making the far bigger bet of reintroducing Steam machines and expanding SteamOS to third-party hardware more broadly in 2026. In other words, the version of this story unfolding right now is not really a sudden surprise. It is the second, far more successful act of a strategy Valve first attempted and failed at more than a decade ago, this time built on a foundation of compatibility technology that simply did not exist back in 2013. Developer and publisher reactions to this shift have also been notably more positive this time around compared to the skepticism that greeted Valve's original Steam Machine push. Because Proton allows most existing Windows games to run on SteamOS automatically through translation without requiring developers to build and maintain a separate native Linux version of their game, the barrier to supporting this growing audience has dropped dramatically compared to a decade ago. Rather than needing studios to commit significant additional engineering resources to court a small Linux audience directly, Valve's approach effectively makes Linux compatibility happen by default for the vast majority of titles, with the compatibility burden falling mainly on Valve's own Proton development team rather than on individual game studios. This is a fundamentally different, far more sustainable model than the original push for native Linux game ports over a decade ago. And it goes a long way toward explaining why compatibility numbers have climbed so much faster and more reliably in the second wave of Valve's Linux gaming strategy. The broader context of Valve's own commercial success with Linux-based hardware also deserves mention, since it explains why manufacturers have grown increasingly comfortable following Valve's lead rather than treating this as an unproven experiment. The original Steam Deck sold well enough and generated enough sustained developer and consumer interest to establish an entirely new hardware category, the PC gaming handheld, that other manufacturers subsequently rushed to compete in the years that followed, mostly using Windows at first, simply because it was the safer, more established default choice at the time. The fact that companies like Lenovo, Asus, and MSI, all of whom initially built their competing handhelds around Windows, have since chosen to add official SteamOS support to their own devices, represents a meaningful vote of confidence from companies with no particular loyalty to Valve or to open source software as a philosophy. These are hardware manufacturers making a straightforward business calculation that enough of their customers want the SteamOS option to justify the engineering and support costs of officially offering it, which is about as clear a signal of genuine, organic consumer demand as you are likely to find in the notoriously fickle world of PC hardware. It is also worth placing this shift within the wider context of what is happening across the broader console and PC gaming industry at the same time, because Linux's rise in gaming has not occurred in isolation from other major shifts reshaping how people play games. Traditional console makers have themselves been blurring the line between console and PC gaming for years, with cross-platform play, subscription-based game libraries, and cloud streaming services all chipping away at the old, rigid boundaries between a dedicated console, a gaming PC, and a handheld device. Microsoft itself has pushed heavily into this same blurred territory with its own Xbox-branded handheld hardware collaborations, built on Windows rather than SteamOS, suggesting that even Microsoft recognizes handheld gaming devices represent a meaningful new frontier worth fighting for, even as SteamOS increasingly threatens Windows' historical default position within that exact same emerging hardware category. Whichever operating system philosophy ultimately wins out in the handheld space specifically, gamers themselves appear to be the clearest beneficiaries of the resulting competition, since manufacturers are now forced to differentiate on actual performance, battery life, and price rather than simply defaulting to whatever operating system happened to dominate the broader PC market historically. Looking ahead, the trajectory here seems very unlikely to reverse itself. Valve has publicly committed to closing the NVIDIA compatibility gap that remains the single biggest technical obstacle to broader desktop adoption. Hardware manufacturers have shown they are willing to offer SteamOS as a genuine consumer choice rather than a niche experiment, and the underlying Proton compatibility technology has continued improving steadily year after year since its original 2018 debut, with no signs of that progress slowing down. Combine that with a Steam hardware survey showing Linux adoption climbing to fresh record highs for consecutive months running, and a real, tangible new piece of hardware in the Steam machine putting Linux directly into people's living rooms, rather than just their laptops or desktops, and it becomes clear this is not a temporary spike in interest that will fade once the novelty wears off. This is a structural, multi-year shift in how PC gaming hardware gets built and sold, driven by a combination of cost savings for manufacturers, measurable performance benefits for players, and steadily improving software compatibility that keeps closing the gap with each passing year. For a very long time, the phrase Linux gaming carried an unspoken asterisk, understood by anyone who had tried it as shorthand for something that mostly worked, with enough exceptions and workarounds required to keep it firmly in hobbyist territory rather than genuine mainstream use. That asterisk has not disappeared entirely, since kernel-level anti-cheat compatibility remains a real and meaningful limitation for a specific slice of the gaming population. But for the large majority of PC gamers, particularly anyone gaming on a handheld device where battery life makes an immediate, tangible difference to the actual experience, that asterisk has shrunk dramatically over a remarkably short period of time. Whether you personally end up switching your own setup or not, 2026 will likely be remembered as the year PC gaming stopped being synonymous with Windows by default and started becoming a genuine choice between multiple credible operating systems, competing directly for gamers' attention on the actual merits of the experience they deliver. If you found this breakdown useful, keep an eye on how Valve's NVIDIA partnership progresses over the coming months. Watch for additional hardware manufacturers following Lenovo's lead with their own factory SteamOS devices. And pay attention to whether Microsoft responds with any meaningful changes of its own to Windows, aimed specifically at the handheld and gaming-focused audience that increasingly has a real alternative sitting right next to it on store shelves. This is one of the more genuinely fascinating platform shifts happening in the technology industry right now, and it is still very much in progress.